As far as we know, Adam Back is the first person to ever be contacted by Satoshi Nakamoto. And the reason is obvious, because Adam Back's proof of work system, Hashcash, was a big part of Bitcoin, of course. So we don't know who's really behind the name Satoshi Nakamoto, or at least I don't.
I do. You'll have to read my book. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, so it's likely a pseudonym. Now, of course, people at that time didn't realize that. The people on the cryptography mailing list, they, for the most part, probably assumed it was, a Japanese man, or at least someone with Japanese parents or something like that. But yeah, most likely it was a pseudonym.
Welcome to the final episode of my series with Aaron van Wirdum, the author of the Genesis book, the story of the people and projects that inspired Bitcoin. Today we're going to talk about Bitcoin.
Finally.
2008, the great financial crisis. There's a political element to this. I think Satoshi in the very first block inscribed a article from, I think it was like the German, the chancellor's on the bailout is on the banks are on the brink of a bailout or something like that.
Chairman on the brink of second bailout for banks, I believe was the actual
like that,
title. Yeah. It was in the Times, so a British newspaper. Do you want to skip there? Because first there was the white paper release, of course, which preceded the first block.
True.
So where do you want to go?
I just thought it was interesting that the time when it was released and the timing of the project being released. Do you think it was a coincidence? Do you think it was?
I think it was largely a coincidence. Now, I do think, Satoshi was inspired by, ideas about monetary reform. And as I show in the book, a lot of the people that were working on digital cash projects were inspired by Hayek specifically, his ideas about the economy and money. And I think Satoshi came from that community. I think there's plenty of reason to think that he was one of the Cypherpunks, or at least aware of their work.
I 100% agree with that.
Now, the exact timing of the release of Bitcoin coinciding so closely with the financial crisis, I do think that's largely a coincidence, because Satoshi would have been working on Bitcoin for a while at that point, right? According to one of Satoshi's own messages on the Bitcoin Talk forum, or maybe it was on the cryptography list. In any case, in Satoshi's own words, he had been working on it for like 2 years.
Yeah.
So he'd been working on it well before the actual financial meltdown happened. So I think that, I do think that he was generally inspired, or he was aware of these problems. But the actual timing of Bitcoin itself, coming like 1 month or so, or, basically in the same year as the financial crisis, that is also coincidence. But yeah, Bitcoin was, it was supposed to be a solution for that problem, or at least that's what I think, and that there's good reason to think that, including, as you mentioned, the message that Satoshi included in the first block. So to clarify, so indeed there's text in the first block. You can just include text in Bitcoin blocks, right? And Satoshi included text in the first Bitcoin block, which refers to the crisis. Now that serves two purposes. The first purpose that it solves is that it shows that this block, the Genesis block, was not mined before the date of the headline, right? Because he wouldn't have known the date.
Couldn't have put that information.
He wouldn't have known. Yeah, exactly. So it proves that the block was not mined before January 3rd, I believe it was. And that's important, because that way you know that Bitcoin hasn't been pre-mined.
It was a fair start.
Yeah, exactly. Satoshi didn't start mining before anyone else had that chance. Small nuance, there were a couple of days between the Genesis block and the actual announcement on the mailing list. So he technically could have mined solo in these years, but the timestamps of the blocks suggest he didn't, and that doesn't seem to have been the case. But even if he did, he could have only had a couple of days. Okay, so the first problem it solves that that Satoshi wasn't mining like months in ahead on his own and getting all this coin for himself. But then, of course, he could have picked any headline to include in the Genesis block, and he chose this specific headline. Well, that's it's a pretty clear hint for what his motivation was.
What is a white paper? What is that?
What is a white paper? No one has ever asked me that question. I would just describe it as a scientific paper, a paper in this case that proposes an idea. I don't know what the dictionary definition of it would be. My common people translation would be a scientific paper, but I don't know. Maybe there's a more specific definition to it that I'm not even aware of.
Yeah, so I'm wondering.
Is Paul looking it up?
Yeah, we're gonna have Paul look it up.
Let's see what the definition is of a white paper.
Because I think this was like a thing in scientific community before Satoshi used that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's for sure. But I don't know what actually qualifies something as a white paper.
A white paper is an authoritative report or guide that addresses a specific issue or topic, often providing a solution or offering insights. It is used to educate readers and help them understand a problem, make a decision, or solve a problem. White papers are commonly used in business, government, and technical fields to present research findings, propose policy or strategy, and provide detailed information on a subject. They are typically well-researched and written in a formal tone, often including data, analysis, and recommendations.
That's what I said.
Yeah, you nailed it. So Satoshi released this white paper, Electronic Cash Without a Trusted Third Party.
Well, the title
Which
you're
was
reading,
the draft.
Yeah. You're now reading the draft title, indeed. So that's he initially sent this white paper to Adam Back. As far as we know, Adam Back is the first person to ever be contacted by Satoshi Nakamoto, and he asked and the reason is obvious because Adam Back's proof of work system, Hashcash, was a big part of Bitcoin, of course. And on top of that, Adam Back was thinking about digital currency more generally, as we went over in the previous episode. So yeah, as far as we know, at least, Adam Back is the first person to ever have been contacted by Satoshi Nakamoto, and he received his draft white paper, and he was basically asking for feedback. Now, Adam Back, at this time, we went over how a lot of the cypherpunks kind of got disillusioned, right, by the idea of electronic cash. And Adam Back was certainly one of them. They've seen a whole bunch of digital cash schemes come and go. They all failed for different reasons. Some went bankrupt, and some were closed down. Some just didn't catch on, etc., etc. So they grew disillusioned by the idea in general, and Adam Back as well. So he didn't really dive into it in the way, he now regrets, of course.
Yeah. He didn't share that. He didn't have that Hal Finney level of enthusiasm for everything, right?
Yeah, you could probably say that.
He was kind of like Wei Dai, who was kind of like, at this point, disillusioned, like we talked about.
Right, yeah. While Hal Finney still had that energy to keep going, Adam Back was more on the level of, I've seen it, and so far nothing works. And also keep in mind, so Satoshi Nakamoto was, of course, a completely unknown name. So you're receiving an email about something you kind of gave up hope in from someone without a reputation, and your time is limited, and you have a job, and you have whatever else you got going in your life. I think most people would probably act the same, right? React the same way.
Might skim it briefly, but
right. I mean, I as a journalist, I ignore most emails that I get. If I don't know who's emailing me, I might take a look at it. Hey, when you guys emailed me, I paid attention.
That is true. You did.
But I'm not gonna.
I piqued your interest.
I'm not gonna look into every white paper someone sends me. Let's put it that way. And I do receive some of these sometimes. With someone that has a new Bitcoin proposal or a cryptocurrency. I don't do that either. So it's very understandable. In retrospect, it seems like it was a stupid move to ignore it. But at the time, in context, I think it makes perfect sense that he didn't. He wasn't going to spend days researching this new thing from this person he didn't know. So anyways, Adam Back mostly kind of ignored it. He did point out that Wei Dai developed a similar system, B-Money, which we discussed in a previous episode. And he told Satoshi Nakamoto that. And then Satoshi Nakamoto also contacted Wei Dai, who had a similar response. So he kind of looked at it, and Wei Dai said, I'll get back to you if I have any thoughts or something.
And never did.
No, never did that. That was sort of the first hints, at least as far as we know of, that Satoshi Nakamoto had thought of something, the early draft of the white paper.
Satoshi listed a lot of these earlier projects. He credited them in the white paper, correct?
Some. So he credited Hashcash and he credited Haber and Stornata's work a lot, the timestamping systems. And then ultimately in the final version of the white paper, he also credited B-Money from Why Die as something that came before Bitcoin, another attempt to create digital cash, which he probably included that because Adam Back pointed him to that. Although at the same time, I do think he was actually aware of it.
I think so too.
Because there's also a later forum post by Satoshi Nakamoto where he does say that Bitcoin was an implementation of B-Money and BitGold. Now, BitGold was also not included, and RPow was also not included. Now, in the case of RPow, that makes the most sense because that worked very differently. But yeah, the ones that are included are Hashcash, the Haber and Stornata timestamping systems, and the B-Money proposal, at least in the final version of the white paper.
I'm going to read a quote from Satoshi. I've been working on a new electronic cash system that's fully peer-to-peer with no trusted third party, Nakamoto's email read, before summing up the main properties. Double spending is prevented with a peer-to-peer network, no mint or other trusted parties, participants can be anonymous. New coins are made from Hashcash-style proof of work. The proof of work for new coin generation also powers the network to prevent double spending.
Yeah, so that's the email he sent to the cryptography mailing list. So for context, in the previous episode, we discussed the Cypherpunks and the Cypherpunk mailing list. And we also went over how the Cypherpunk mailing list kind of started to fall apart and it was overrun by spam and scammers and flame wars and just the overall quality deteriorated. And the cryptography mailing list was basically the de facto successor of the Cypherpunks mailing list. So a lot of the same people were on there, but it was more heavily moderated to kind of keep discussions on topic and, the higher quality essentially. So
I do notice that. Are you subscribed to the cryptography mailing list?
No, I'm not. I mean, I've read a bunch on it, but I'm not personally a subscriber. No. So when the next Bitcoin is announced, I'll probably miss it again.
It is useful. I mean, I think you can like control some of the settings and like mine, I just get like a daily report of like, different conversations that are being discussed.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. So the email. Yeah. So he basically sent that email to the de facto successor of the Cypherpunks mailing list, which, at least for me, is another indication that he
was from that
knew
community.
about this.
Of course. I mean, that's a very niche community.
Probably part of it's quite niche. So he was probably part of it. That's the most likely explanation in my mind, anyways. So he proposed he sent the white paper and therefore proposed Bitcoin for the first time on October 31st, 2008.
I think you could talk about this later, but I think we should talk about it now. Satoshi Nakamoto is obviously this concept of a pseudonym. You want to explain that and go into detail there? Because again,
so as I mentioned, Adam Back, of course, didn't recognize the name Satoshi Nakamoto. Neither did White Eye, and the reason for that is simple: the name didn't exist in these circles before that. So it's probably, almost certainly a pseudonym. So it's not someone's real name; it's just someone using a fake name. So we don't know who's really behind the name Satoshi Nakamoto, or at least I don't.
I do. You'll have to read my book. I'm just kidding.
So it's likely a pseudonym. Now, of course, people at that time didn't realize that. The people on the cryptography mailing list, they, for the most part, probably assumed it was, a Japanese man, or at least someone with Japanese parents or something like that. But yeah, most likely it was a pseudonym.
And you use the term, you write here, his name carried no reputational weight, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's an important factor because we talked about, Adam Back and Wei Dai just kind of blowing it off, right? It was
it's quite likely that if the email had been sent by, say, a Halvini, say an Ixabo, say an Adam Back, that people would have paid more attention. But because it was sent by this, someone that no one had ever heard about, I do think that, for the same reason that Adam Back didn't pay that much attention at first, that was probably true for most of these, cypherpunks or cryptographers on this cryptography mailing list.
Let's talk about the blockchain, because I think that's really the core innovation here.
Uh-huh. Yeah, just explaining how it works, or?
Bitcoin users wouldn't need to reveal their names to use the system. They could send and receive money semi-anonymously, revealing only their public keys. Nakamoto suggested that users generate a new key pair for each incoming transaction. This would go a long way to protect users' privacy. Though Nakamoto acknowledged in the white paper that it wouldn't be perfect, some linking is still unavoidable with multi-input transactions. I guess start with telling us what the blockchain is, and then let's talk about privacy a little bit and this concept of I think it's pseudonymity, not full privacy, but some level of privacy.
Yeah, so the blockchain, it to a large extent, it really looks like what Haber and Strunetta. I always say Haber, but it's probably Haber.
Haber, yes, Stuart Haber.
Yeah, what Haber and Strunetta were developing with the timestamping system. So the way Bitcoin works, kind of in a nutshell, or at least how the blockchain works, is transactions are sent over the Bitcoin network basically constantly. But of course, you need to solve the double spend problem. Like if someone sends one transaction to multiple people at the same time, or different parts of the network, the different parts of the network may have a different idea of what the state of the ledger is, who owns what. So the way that's solved in Bitcoin is there's different steps to this, but the first step is the transactions, if they're just circulating on the network, they're unconfirmed. So users, nodes, they see the transactions, but the transactions are not confirmed yet. When are they confirmed? They're confirmed when they're included in a block. So a block is really a collection of transactions. It's a block full of data that for the most part includes transactions. Once a transaction is included in a block, which is found on average once every 10 minutes, then it's confirmed. So you really need to wait for at least one confirmation. So every 10 minutes, a block is found on average, and the transactions that are included in the block, that's the confirmed ones. Now that solves part of the problem, but it's still possible that, say, there's different transactions on different parts of the network, there's conflicting transactions, someone tries to double spend, and it's still possible that by coincidence, two different blocks are mined on these different parts of the network. So someone's creating two different blocks that still have a conflicting transaction. So how do you decide which one to go with? Everyone needs to settle on one answer. So how do you do that? Well, interestingly, at first, you actually don't. So at first, the two parts of the network just have a different version of history.
Mm-hmm.
However, these different parts of the network now start to mine on a new block. They try to find a new block. For that, they use the first block as well. That's included in the next block. And then whoever finds the next block first and now has a longer chain of blocks, and then everyone settles on that. So the conflict is essentially resolved through a race. At some point, it becomes clear which chain is longer, and then everyone just says, all right, we're going to settle on this way. Even if you were on the shorter chain, you just throw that block away. And that, over time, is how everyone's going to settle on the longest chain. Now, what's new, so a lot of this, like the chaining of data, including data in blocks, that Strunetta and Haber already figured it out, right, for timestamping. And then even the chaining of these different blocks together, so you get a string of blocks, that was also already proposed by them. What's new here is that in order to create a block, you need to use proof of work. So we went over proof of work. You hash something, and then only if a hash has enough leading zeros, then the hash is considered valid. So in this case, users on the network, which we call miners, they're actually taking these blocks and then hashing them. And then only if the hash results in enough leading zeros is that block considered valid by everyone else. So you take that data structure, the blockers of data, but now you add the function, you add the future, you add the property that these blocks are only valid if they have a valid hash as well, if they hash to a valid hash.
So here you wrote that Satoshi believed he had solved the Byzantine general's problem, and this was in regards to resolving these chain splits.
Yeah.
With the longer chain of proof of work.
Yeah, the important part is the chain that gets longer is probably the chain that has most people working on it,
which is
that has most miners hashing to find the next block. That's statistically always going to be the longest
likely,
chain.
yeah. Which means it has the most proof of work, electricity, and energy behind it, and that resolves that issue. Which brings us to mining. Let's talk about mining. What is mining?
So that is basically mining. So mining is trying to find a new block. You know, you're collecting all this data, all these transactions. You're including some random data. You include the timestamp. You include some other things, and then you hash. So that's basically what we're doing. And when you find a valid hash, you find a valid block. Now, why would anyone do this? It's because this is also how coins come in circulation for the first time. So when you find a valid block, if you find a block, it has a hash that has enough leading zeros, you find a valid block, then as a reward, you also get to pay yourself new coins. So in that sense, Bitcoin sort of solves two problems at once. It solves the problem of preventing double spends. And at the same time, it solves the problem of getting money into circulation without anyone in control, without anyone in charge.
Without a central
right? There's no central bank, there's no company.
Without the ARPANET server.
Yeah, exactly. So you still need to get these coins in circulation. So the way that's done is you basically have some sort of a lottery. So everyone's hashing. If you get lucky, you find a valid block, valid hash, so a valid block, and you get the coins.
Proof of work would be used as a consensus mechanism. I like that. What's a nonce?
Well, a nonce is the random number that if you're a miner, so you're a miner, right? You're trying to find a block, which means, let's say you got 1,000 transactions, and now you're gonna you make a block out of that, and you're gonna hash that. Okay. Does the hash have enough leading zeros to make it a valid block? If yes, great, you get the new coins, the block is valid. If not, you gotta try something new, right? You gotta try mining, need to try hashing it again, but to get to a different result. So if you have no new transactions, then you would just hash through the same thing every time, because a hash is always the same thing. So what miners do is they include a nonce, a random number basically, and then they hash it again. So for every hash they try, they include this random number, and then every time they get a different hash, and that's how they can keep trying it, thousands of times per microsecond, actually, and just be including these new nonces time and time and time again until it finally results in a valid hash.
Can you further expound on this concept of a block reward and also transaction fees?
Yeah, so block reward. So of course we all know, or at least most people know, that Bitcoin has this limited supply of 21 million. So how do you get to 21 million? The way that's done is the blocks, the new coins that come into circulation, that decreases over time. So for the first 4 years of Bitcoin existence, there were 15 new coins in each block. So if you've mined a valid block, you get 50 new coins. Then after 4 years, this was cut in half. So after 4 years, it went to 25 new coins per block. And then 4 years after that, it went to 12 and a half, and so forth. Now, if you keep going, then eventually in the year 2140, there's no more new coins. So then the limit, if you add it all up, you get to the limit of 21 million. It's actually 20,999,999.999, but at least it's less than 21 million. So there's a max of 21 million. Now, what happens when there are no new coins anymore to be brought in circulation? Why would anyone try to mine a new block, right? So, or even when that gets really low, when the new coins in a new block are very low, why would anyone try to mine a new block? The answer to that question is transaction fees. So whenever you send a Bitcoin transaction, you also include a fee. What you really do is you send, say, 1 Bitcoin and the recipient gets 0.999, and then the difference is the fee. So every transaction has a fee, and the miner gets to take this as well. So the miner adds up what all the transaction fees in an entire block are, and then the miner can pay itself according to the network rules, both the new coins as well as all these transaction fees and whatever they add up to.
Paul, can you do me a favor? Can you pull up bitfeed.live? Just want to have it up there for anybody watching the video stream of this, and we can kind of show it. It's really cool. Oh, it's not being shared, but okay. Could you overlay it potentially? Okay, cool. I think, yeah, I think it's really cool to visualize what we're talking about. Aaron, do you see, because Satoshi really thought a lot about the game theory of everything that he designed. Do you agree with his assessment that when all of the block rewards are essentially distributed, that transaction fees will be a viable thing for miners?
I think this is still one of the big open questions about Bitcoin. So yeah, in theory, or at least the idea is that transaction fees should be enough to keep mining viable and secure enough. I think there's reason to believe that we'll get there. Like if you look at the early days of Bitcoin, transaction fees were basically zero, or actually zero.
Yeah.
Miners just included transactions because, why not? Now, however, transaction fees are definitely increasing. This is in large part because the space that is available for transactions in a block, the size of blocks, is limited. So in order to get your transaction included in a block, or in order to get it included faster than other transactions, you have to bid against each other. There's
it's a free market for block space, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So people are bidding against each other to get a transaction included, and because of that, we've seen transaction fees increase pretty significantly. So for that, even just for that reason, there's good reason to think that it will be viable. Now, there's another argument which says that transaction fees are actually what makes Bitcoin censorship resistant. We're going pretty deep into at least one of the technical rabbit holes here, but that argument is so the transaction fee offers a direct incentive for a miner to include a transaction in a block. So even in a world where governments try to regulate Bitcoin or at least censor certain transactions, then that would in practice just mean that the people that are being censored would have to increase their transaction fees to a level where the risk makes sense for miners to do it anyways, to basically break the law to get a transaction included. So that's where the censorship resistance ultimately would emerge from. Now, this is one view. There's sort of different views on this, but that's at least one view, that transaction fees are what makes Bitcoin censorship resistant.
Definitely an interesting philosophical rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah, I mean, another view is that miners just have the job of including transactions. And if they were ever not to do that, for example, because they are being regulated, which can only happen if they're centralized, if that were to ever happen, then actually Bitcoin should fire the miners.
Yeah.
Like change the proof of work algorithm to just get rid of all the ASICs, for example, and that would move forward that way. But these are sort of different visions of what a future with censorship or attempted censorship would sort of look like.
I think it would just incentivize a more decentralized mining operation to benefit from those transaction fees that are being censored by more.
Yeah, so that's more the first view. That's
I like that view. I think
that's a very plausible version of the future, so to say.
So when we talk about BitGold and we talk about RPow and we talk about Hashcash and some of these other implementations, one of the biggest things was Moore's Law and the compute growing, which would greatly hyperinflate the supply or push out these coins much faster, right? At higher issuance rates. One of Satoshi's genius ways to resolve this problem is the difficulty adjustment algorithm. Tell us about that.
Yeah, indeed. So one of the big challenges that other electronic cash systems tried to solve was indeed this inflation issue. If you use proof of work to create new money, and over time computers become faster, then over time it becomes easier to create new money, and easier and easier and easier, and it leads to a form of hyperinflation. So this is, for example, what RPow dealt with. Like this was going to be the future of RPow, because it's going to hyperinflate because it gets easier to create new tokens. And that's probably, at least in part, why it didn't catch on, because it didn't offer the incentive for people to accept it if you know that this currency is going to hyperinflate in the future. So Bitcoin indeed solved this. So I mentioned that a new block is mined every 10 minutes, and that this is done through hashing. So miners got a hash, and only some hashes are valid. So they try to create a new block, and it will only work on average once in 10 minutes. Now, what Satoshi introduced, and this is really kind of one of the few or only real technical innovation that Bitcoin had, because for the other part, it was sort of pieces of the puzzles of these other digital cash schemes or these time-stamping systems. What Bitcoin really introduced was the difficulty adjustment algorithm. So what that did was, if blocks would be found on average more than once per 10 minutes, then the system, because blocks have a timestamp in it, so you know when they are mined. So if too many blocks are mined in a 2-week window, more than once every 10 minutes, then the system, the project, all nodes would know, it's too easy to find blocks. And then automatically the difficulty would go up. What that means in a practical sense is if you create a hash, it now needs more leading zeros. So it's even rarer to find a block, but because more people are now trying, it goes back to one block every 10 minutes. The opposite is also true. So if blocks are found on average, say every 15 minutes over the span of, 2 or 3 weeks, then the system, it's embedded in the code, then the difficulty will actually go down. And now you need fewer leading zeros in hash. So it becomes easier to find a new block. And then again, it resets to like once every 10 minutes. So no matter how many people are mining, no matter how many people are trying, no matter how fast or slow their computers are, eventually it will always get back to this average of one block every 10 minutes. Now, because of that, and because we know how many coins are issued in every block, we have a fairly accurate, or almost perfectly accurate knowledge of how many coins are in circulation at what time, both in the past and in the future. It's a perfectly predictable supply curve, essentially.
It allows you to see the stock to flow sort of over time.
Yeah, so you see how many coins are in circulation and how many new coins will come in circulation in any specific year. It is reliable, predictable money supply.
I'm going to read a quote from your book here. By decoupling the amount of proof of work and the rate of currency creation, Nakamoto had solved the inflation problem, allowing Bitcoin issuance to more closely resemble that of a precious metal. The steady addition of a constant amount of new coins is analogous to gold miners expending resources to add gold to circulation, the Bitcoin white paper explained. In our case, it is CPU time and electricity that is expended. The last thing he talked about in the white paper, he referenced an introduction to probability theory and its applications by mathematician William Feller. He did so much thinking about all of the game theory behind this whole system. And I think it's played such a large part and role in how everything has developed over the past decade to 2 decades, decade and a half. What are your thoughts there?
So the general concepts that he refers to in that in that footnote is I think it's called a gambler's ruin problem, and the idea there being that, let's say someone is trying to cheat the system, but they don't have a majority of hash power. Now, the only way to cheat the system in Bitcoin is to create a longer chain and sort of double spend in that longer chain. So what you would do, there's several versions of this attack, but let's say you send a transaction to someone, you're buying shoes, custom-made shoes, and you get the shoes, and this transaction is included in the block, right? Mm-hmm. Now you yourself create a new block, and you create the same transaction. You send the same money to yourself in that transaction. So now there's conflicting transactions, but you keep mining on that alternative chain until it's longer. So now you've effectively got the shoes and you got your money back. So that's called a double spend attack. Now the point Satoshi was making is that if you don't have the majority hash power, this becomes practically impossible very fast. So if you have 30% of hash power and you're on a shorter chain, then the longer the other chain gets, the smaller the chance that you're gonna get lucky enough to catch up.
Yeah.
So what we assume in Bitcoin generally, of course, is if a transaction has 6 confirmations, then it's final. You can technically speaking, it's not final. Technically speaking, it's only statistically, implausible.
Probably,
if someone with a minority hash rate gets very lucky 10 times in a row,
which is possible,
but
highly unlikely.
Yeah, then they can still double spend, but it's so unlikely that with 6 confirmations, you don't really have to worry about it.
You don't consider it at all. The other aspect of this, which I think is really interesting, is that even if you are able to assemble most of the majority of the hash power of the network, which is today unfathomable if you were able to do that because there's so much power securing this decentralized network. The financial incentive to double spend a transaction or just be compensated by the massive rewards that you're going to be getting from over half of all the blocks that are created and the transaction fees, is so ridiculous that of course you're going to just be an honest participant in the system because it's so much more game theoretically and financially rewarding, right?
Yeah, that's one of the things Satoshi points out, indeed, is that even if an attacker has the majority hash rate, it might still make sense to just act honestly, because that way you earn all the new coins that are coming into circulation, plus the fees, of course. And if you attack the system, then all these coins could become worthless. So the incentives sort of align in that sense.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure if I completely agree with that assessment, because it really depends on what or who the attacker is.
Governments don't play by the same incentive structure, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if let's say the U.S. government, wants to keep its dollar hegemony, to sort of point out an obvious example, and that's why they are trying to get rid of Bitcoin, then actually the incentives may play out in favor of attacking the system. But otherwise, in many cases, I think Satoshi was right that the incentives do align. Even if you have a majority hash rate, you probably got to want to be an honest player. As we've seen, for example, maybe we're still seeing it, right? Maybe Bitmain has a
Have you heard Antonopoulos' argument against this? And as a miner myself, plugged into all these hardware marketplaces, I just see the possibility of a government attacking the network to be just unfathomable, just because if they did attempt to buy up all those machineries to get that hash power to deploy that infrastructure, there's no way to hide a deployment of that size. And there's no way to go to the market and just buy up that many machines without massively increasing the market price of machines on yourself.
But if you are a government, you can also just confiscate it.
Confiscate all the mining rigs all over the world in all these different places?
Not if they're everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
But if they're all located in one country, like China, which has been the case for a while, then you do have the risk that the government just knocks on someone's door and says, these are ours now, do what we say or else you go to jail. So I do think that's, I think the thing you're referring to, the Antonopoulos quote, is more about changing the rules. What if the NSA or any government would want to buy up this hash power and change the rules of Bitcoin? Now that's impossible. Or at least it's impossible to do that as a hard fork, because then you're basically just creating an altcoin. But it is possible to do it either, if you want to call it a soft fork, or just as censorship. So it is possible that if a lot of hardware is located in the same country, and the government at some point says, hey, we don't want these transactions to be mined, then they could step in. They could knock on their door and say, these transactions are now censored.
I guess the question is, how are they even going to find all this equipment? Because there's so much infrastructure that's not even connected to the grid. Even in China, right now they banned mining, but there's actually more mining going on in China now than there was before the ban.
I'm not commenting on how realistic or plausible it is right now.
I guess that's
just
what I'm thinking of.
Pointing it out as an abstract risk.
Okay, gotcha.
If the majority of hash rate is located in a handful of data centers in a single country, then that does become a real risk.
Absolutely. I do agree with that. Peer-to-peer, because I think that's a big part of this. Not having to depend on any trusted third party, any central server. So here it says all users would be equals on the network.
Yeah. So Bitcoin really sort of takes after BitTorrent in that sense, right? So we explained in a previous episode that BitTorrent was sort of the evolution of peer-to-peer technology. First, you had Napster. Napster was still run by a company that operated a network. Napster could be shut down, and then eventually, through modulation, you get to BitTorrent, which was entirely peer-to-peer, meaning that users on the system, nodes, they share information in the case of Bitcoin. Transactions with each other directly. So they're not relying on any central company or bank or server or anything like that. It's just users, peers on the network communicating with each other directly. And thereby, the users of the system, are also the operators of the system. And that makes it hard to shut down. Like that's the big benefit here. If there is no company to shut down, well, where do you go? Are you going to knock on, tens of thousands of doors all across the world? You can try to do that, but as long as people can actually be a part of the network from their own home on their computer, well, it's very hard, if not impossible, to shut that down, as we've seen with BitTorrent, and Bitcoin uses that same design infrastructure.
I think Satoshi has a quote about that later. I'm trying to see if I can find it. Yeah, he says, governments are good at cutting off the heads of centrally controlled networks like Napster, but peer-to-peer networks like Nutella and Tor seem to be holding their own.
Right.
Just as central banks across the world were deploying unprecedented interventions across the financial system in desperate attempts to prevent a full-blown economic collapse, Satoshi Nakamoto proposed a new type of money that could operate without financial institutions altogether. A digital currency system based entirely on math. Love that.
Me too.
Let's talk a little bit about scalability, because there was a lot of chatter. I remember reading this myself of just different discussions on the mailing lists. And
yeah, so generally speaking, when Bitcoin was first proposed on the cryptography mailing list, the response actually wasn't very positive. For a large part, it was ignored. And then the people that did respond, for the most part, were critical. Now, the critical responses you can kind of divide into two categories. There was one type of criticism that came from people that just didn't really understand how it works. So you can dismiss these as well. But, dismiss it in the sense of, they just didn't understand. We don't really have to address that. They just didn't get how it works. But there was also very early on some valid criticism. And I would say the most obvious one of that was Bitcoin didn't scale very well. And some people recognize that immediately, basically. So, yeah, why doesn't it scale very well? Because if you want to use the system securely, if you want to make sure that whenever you're getting paid, you're actually getting paid, the coins you're getting paid with weren't already spent to someone else, and they were also honestly mined. They weren't just created out of thin air. The only way to know for sure that you're actually getting paid is to know everything that happened so far. So you need to essentially know about every transaction, including the transaction where new coins are minted, and then every transaction where the coins moved. Every transaction that ever happened in the history of Bitcoin, you need to know about it. Now, if millions of people are transacting with Bitcoin and they're making dozens of transactions a day or however many, then on your home computer it's going to be really hard to keep track of all of that. You need to download all these transactions, process it all, store it all, potentially verify it all. It's this type of stuff requires data centers. So if that's true, if it requires a data center, well, then you can't really be a peer on the network. Most people cannot be a peer on the network if that's the case. So that was pointed out very early on. Now, of course, when Bitcoin just launched, no one was using it yet. So at first, it wasn't really a problem. At first, there were barely any transactions at all. So anyone could be a peer on the network. But they did foresee that if Bitcoin keeps growing, this is going to be a problem. It didn't scale very well. Now, the solution that Satoshi at some point introduced, although there's some debate over whether that was his intention, but whatever his intention was, Satoshi did at some point introduce the block size limit. So
What about the simplified payment verification that he talked about in his white paper?
Oh, good.
Because that kind of touches on a lot of it, what you're describing. And it almost seems like he implemented what like networks like Ethereum and Solana have done, where it's so costly to run that what he wanted to do was have this fully validating network node, and then you'd have the lightweight nodes as well.
Yeah, good thing you bring that up. So Satoshi's own proposal for scaling in the white paper was called simplified payments verification, SPV. What that would mean is that you kind of only pay attention to the transactions that affect you. In other words, you only look at transactions. You ignore most transactions that happen on the network and that are included in the blockchain, and you only look at the transactions that are sent to you. Now, that is possible in much the same way that in Haber and Stornetta's timestamping, it was possible to prove that a specific document was included somewhere in the time chain or in the.
He credits Merkle too, I think, in the white paper. So I think he had this idea of taking all of these transactions and then hashing them and only storing the root, Merkle root.
Right. So that he did describe this vision in the white paper. The problem with it is that it's not secure.
Yeah.
So that's what I was just explaining. Even if someone's sending a transaction to you, even if you can see, well, this is a valid transaction in the sense that it has a valid signature and it's actually sending money to my address, you're still not sure if these coins even existed in the first place or if these coins weren't already spent to someone else because you don't know about all the other transactions. So really the only way to make sure that a transaction to you is valid is if you know the entire history. Now, Satoshi did propose a solution to this problem called, what was it called?
I'm curious.
Do you remember what it's called?
I'm not sure what I was going to ask you what the ended solution, because I think it was James Donald was raising these concerns, and he brought up the concerns with this, but I'm curious how Satoshi solved this.
Well, he didn't.
He didn't solve it. Okay, that's all, because I'm like, I didn't, I read the book, but it's like I couldn't figure that out. Okay.
No, he didn't solve it. The term is slipping my mind. He proposed that. Man, what's the term? Anyways, he proposed that there would be some sort of tool that if someone would notice that someone was trying to cheat on the network, you can send that to a light node, and then the light node would know, oh, maybe I'm being cheated here. However, this technology doesn't actually exist. So Satoshi proposed it as sort of a solution, but there's no technical details of how the solution would actually work. And developers today think it's not possible. So this solution that Satoshi proposed, SPV, it looks like it's not actually possible. So therefore, Bitcoin has kind of the scaling problem, which we've so far at least solved with, well, in part, the block size limit.
Moore's law kind of solves it too, just because technology grows so much faster over time that it's lightweight to store all these transactions if the blocks are so small, right?
A bit, but it's definitely an unsolved problem for the most part. So the route that Bitcoin developers and Bitcoin community has gone in now for the most part is to scale through layers.
Yeah.
So scale through the Lightning Network, scale through sidechains, perhaps scale through other solutions. Then
I see what you're saying.
Instead of including everything on the blockchain. Yeah,
okay.
and that's because this SPV solution didn't actually work.
Well,
not in a secure way.
Not in the way that you need a decentralized global money to operate, but it works for other protocols that don't need that level of decentralization.
That's fair.
Maybe it's video game money or NFTs or some stuff that you don't need the same level of decentralization that you need for something like money, like decentralized global money, right?
Yeah, if you make different trust trade-offs, you can make it work.
Exactly.
So if you're willing to trust miners, in the case of Bitcoin specifically, if you're willing to trust that miners are going to remain honest, then you can go for solutions like this. But at least the philosophy in Bitcoin is that you should be able to use it trustlessly.
Yeah.
But in general, this is an unsolved problem. It is a work in progress, you could say.
Yeah. Well, I think that this idea of using layers, Donald, I think Dillinger here, and Finney ultimately, I think he said, we get to Finney and his optimism, right? Bitcoin seems to be a very promising idea. Hal Finney opened his email. But here he says, like Donald, Finney was also quick to suggest that Bitcoin could benefit from a lightweight payment solution on top of its protocol. Besides better scalability, the electronic cash veteran pointed out that this could provide more and even stronger privacy features. There have also been proposals for building lightweight anonymous payment schemes on top of heavyweight non-anonymous systems, so Bitcoin could be leveraged to allow for anonymity even beyond the mechanism discussed in the paper, he wrote. I think we kind of see this with Lightning today, where you kind of get a little bit more anonymity if you tuck your Bitcoin into that L2 almost and transact
or
there.
what they were probably referring to was also ideas like what today would be called Fediment and Cashew. So building eCash types of systems on Bitcoin. But indeed, James A. Donald and Hal Finney in particular, as some of the first people that responded to Satoshi Nakamoto's proposal, they immediately pointed out that the future of Bitcoin was probably to scale through layers, which of course wasn't a new idea either, because, for example, the Xabos BitGold, used payment layers as well. So yeah, they were very quick to point this out as a solution, and that is what that is sort of what we're seeing today. And to your point about Hal Finney, so he was kind of the positive exception. So I mentioned that a lot of people on the on the cryptography mailing list were sort of skeptical of Bitcoin, or they were just ignoring it, or they were critiquing it either for good or bad reasons. And Hal Finney was one of the few people that actually, was encouraging Satoshi to build the system and to improve it, and came up with this solution of layers, or at least endorsed it. And after that, of course, when Bitcoin did launch, he was the first user besides Satoshi, or at least the first recipient of a Bitcoin transaction.
Solving the global, massively decentralized database problem is arguably the harder part, Finney wrote. The use of proof of work as a tool for this purpose is a novel idea well worth further review, in my opinion. Why do you think Hal was so intrigued, where so many other people weren't?
I think it's a character attribute of his. As I explained also in the previous episode, I think it was, he just sort of wasn't giving up. He kept interested in digital cash. He kept trying to implement it with RPAO. And probably also he, in part because of RPAO's failure, he probably saw how useful it was that Bitcoin had this limited supply. Like he was the first person to really recognize the powerful potential and the sort of game theory that's attached by that. Like he made this calculation that, because it was so cheap to mine Bitcoin, and then you can kind of calculate, okay, what if Bitcoin succeeds? How much would a Bitcoin be worth in a future where Bitcoin is actually used as a global money? And I believe his calculation was $100,000 for one Bitcoin. And then if you imagine that it costs a couple of cents to create a Bitcoin, his reasoning was, well, what's the odds of it succeeding? Maybe it's a good idea to get some in case it catches on, which of course Satoshi endorsed as well.
Do you think that Hal knew who Satoshi really was? Do you think that could be a part of this?
I don't think so. I
know he's denied it, but just curious because he's no longer with us, unfortunately.
Yeah, he denied it. I suspect that he doesn't know, but I mean, I don't know what he knew and doesn't know, and I also don't know who was Satoshi. So to spoil that ahead of you asking that,
I'm not going to ask you.
Okay.
Satoshi here says, it's very attractive to the libertarian viewpoint if we can explain it properly. Bitcoin's inventor answered, I'm better with code than with words, though. Let me find that quote you just mentioned that Hal said, where he explained a lot of this. As an amusing thought experiment, imagine that Bitcoin is successful and becomes the dominant payment system in use throughout the world. Then the total value of the currency should be equal to the total value of all the wealth in the world. Current estimates of total worldwide household wealth that I have found range from 100 trillion to 300 trillion. With 20 million coins, that gives each coin a value of about 10 million, he calculated. So the possibility of generating coins today with a few cents of compute time may be quite a good bet, with a payoff of something like 100 million to 1. Even if the odds of Bitcoin succeeding to this degree are slim, are they really 100 million to 1 against? Something to think about. That's probably one of his most famous quotes.
I was way off. I thought he thought that Bitcoin would be worth 100,000 in this world, but it's actually 10 million. I'm off by 2 factors.
I mean, and I think today we're in the quadrillions of global value, right? I think the stock market or the real estate market itself is like 300 trillion, right? And then, I think negative yielding bonds are like 100 trillion or something crazy. And, bonds are like 500 trillion. So I think this was obviously written 20, 30, 40 years ago. I mean, yeah, fascinating. Law, language, money. The three paradigms of spontaneously occurring institutions. Now, fortunately, law and language have been allowed to develop. Money has originated in original form, but as soon as it was there in its most primitive form, it was frozen. Government said it must not develop any further, and what we have had since that development were matters of government inventions, mostly wrong, mostly abuses of money, and I have come to the position of asking, has monetary policy ever done any good? I don't think it has. I think it has done only harm. That's why I'm now pleading for what I've called denationalization of money. So I think that was Hayek.
That was Hayek in one of his last interviews in 1984, I believe. So he was also like 84 years old because he was 85 maybe. He was born in 1899, right? Mm-hmm. At this stage, he was like an old man. And he was still promoting this idea of denationalization of money. At this point, he came to the conclusion that the way to achieve that was to actually create something that governments cannot stop. Mm-hmm. It's part of the same interview.
And I think that takes us to the beginning quote of the book where you say, and this is kind of summarizes it, it's not the exact quote, but instead of trying to convince governments to give up their de facto money monopoly, the people would have to, and I quote what he said, by some sly, roundabout way, introduce something they can't stop. Do you think Satoshi was inspired?
I don't believe that we shall ever have a good money again before we take the thing out of the hands of government. Since we can't take them violently out of the hands of government, all we can do is, by some slight roundabout way, introduce something they can't stop. Quote.
This is like a call to arms. Do you think that Satoshi read that and knew that?
I have not found a direct link between Satoshi and Hayek's work. It's mostly a lot of indirect links. So, the way the book is written, it's of course like an evolution of ideas. And it is very obvious to me that, we don't know who Satoshi was, but it is obvious to me that he was himself inspired by the Cypherpunks, and he was probably one of them. Mm-hmm. And then the Cypherpunks were inspired by Hayek's ideas. But it's not like I found a direct reference from Satoshi to Hayek. Now, of course, what Satoshi wrote is kind of limited anyways. He was only around for the span of, 2.5 years. And most of his posts were like technical. So he didn't elaborate in depth anyways what he was trying to achieve. It's really kind of snippets here and there. Mm-hmm. So I do believe that Hayek's ideas influenced him at least indirectly. Mm-hmm. If whether or not they influenced him directly, I wouldn't be able to answer that question.
Interesting. I definitely think it did. Let's talk a little bit about the code base. So we spoke earlier on with the Cathedral and the Bazaar chapter, and we were talking about MIT and all these different things. Bitcoin obviously was released as free and open source software. Interestingly enough, it was the MIT license and not the GPL license. So I guess
that's a small detail, but indeed, the license that Satoshi used was actually more permissive than the one that Stallman developed. So
it doesn't seem that way at first, but then when you really unpack it, it really is, right?
Yeah. So Stallman's license, so his free software license, I think he developed a couple of variants, but at least the first one had this concept that you could only use the code if your own software was also free software. Mm-hmm. So free software, you can of course copy and reuse and edit and etc. But under this license, that could only happen if you would then yourself allow other people to do that with your software as well. Bitcoin does not have that. So with Bitcoin, you can also take the code and then use it for some proprietary, commercial closed source project. So it's kind of even more free in a way.
Yeah, it gives you the ultimate choice what you want to do.
This is the code. You can just do with it whatever you want, essentially. I think the only condition is you need to credit the original developers. So you need to, that's why if you start up Bitcoin Core, it says by the Bitcoin developers actually in that case.
Gotcha.
Or more to the point, if you start like a Litecoin code or a Bitcoin Cash node, then I think it also says it still credits the Bitcoin Core developers.
Yeah. What's the significance of this? Why does it have to be open source?
In the case of Bitcoin, there's, I would say, two big reasons. One is, well, it has turned out that open source can produce good code. Like if a lot of people are paying attention to it, then any bugs will be found. Right?
Linus's law,
Linus's law. So it is, from a practical, pragmatic perspective, important that Bitcoin has good code, and therefore it makes sense to make it open source so anyone can help improve it. But the even bigger part, of course, or maybe not of course, but the even bigger part is that if Bitcoin is going to be trustless, then it has to be open source. It has to be free software. Everyone needs to be able to see that there's really only 21 million coins that can ever come into circulation. Everyone must be able to know for sure that if you own coins, there's not a backdoor for a developer to just take them. So the only way for Bitcoin to actually be trustless is it needs to be this free software that anyone can see how it actually works. You don't want to have to trust some company or some developers to tell you how it works. No, anyone can verify that for themselves.
I run into this issue a lot when I'm trying to educate new Bitcoiners and teach new Bitcoiners. And they always ask me, well, how do you know how do you know this is really, there's only 21 million. How do you know this? And then I have to explain this concept that, the code is completely open source. You can see what every line of code, you can see what everything does. So that is full transparency when it comes to, a protocol.
Yeah, exactly. It wouldn't be trustless otherwise. This is what makes Bitcoin trustless to a very large extent.
One of Bitcoin's first full-time developers you listed here says that Satoshi's code was brilliant but sloppy, and it was written in C++. Why do you think he chose C++? And then also he used a new programming language called Script, which was inspired by Forth, which was itself designed apparently to operate radio telescopes. What's the significance here?
I don't know exactly. The quote is from Gavin Andreessen. I'm not a programmer, right? But what I've understood from programmers is that C++ does give you a lot of control over what the code actually does and doesn't do. So it's a relatively hands-on type of programming language. While some other programming languages for simplicity have sort of automated or obscured things away, C++ is very hands-on. This is what I've been told anyways. It uses its own version of a programming language in itself, Bitcoin. So you can program transactions essentially. These are kind of very bare bones type of smart contract tools. So you can, for example, create a multi-sig transaction, right? So it's not just that coins can move from A to B. It's also that you can say these coins can only move if 2 out of these 3 public keys have signed, or they can only move if a certain amount of time has passed, or they can only move if both 2 out of 3 keys have signed and a certain amount of time have passed, or only 1 key and more time. I don't know. You can sort of program conditions, and in Bitcoin's case, it's quite basic. So it's indeed it's based on Forth, which was another computer programming language used for radio telescopes in the 60s, I believe. It's quite old. But then with these different tools, you can sort of start to mix and match and combine, and you can also create more complex types of smart contracts. It's not unlimited. You cannot create any type of smart contracts, but it does allow for the programmability of money. So it's not just... it allows also scaling layers, for example. So you can the Lightning Network in itself, by cleverly combining several of these smart contract tools, this basic programming language, you can create an entire new payment system on top of Bitcoin that builds on this.
Satoshi definitely seemed interested in this, and not all of his ideas were well received. Did you ever read about his escrow idea?
Remind me. I do think the answer is yes, but
Okay.
remind me.
He had this idea, and this was just from reading his forum posts, and I've never seen anybody really talk about this or read about this, but it was kind of like this multi-sig wallet where if you did a transaction with somebody, you would send the Bitcoin to this multi-sig wallet, and they would ship you the goods, and there was no way for you to get the money back out of the wallet, and there was also no way for the end recipient to get the money out of that wallet. But if he didn't send you the goods, you could essentially just burn the money, right? But if he did send you the goods, then you could release the money so he could get it. And it was not well received on the forum, but the game theory was well thought out because there's really no benefit to somebody not following through. It took away the benefit from trying to scam somebody, right? Of like, hey, send me the Bitcoin and I'll send you this thing, and then not sending the item. They would never win. They would never benefit from that because the Bitcoin would just be locked forever.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like a multi-sig escrow.
I mean, another pretty popular application, of course, is to use free keys, like so free keys where I have one, you have one, and then we both trust someone else with the third one. And if I'm buying something from you, I'm sending the keys to this address that has free keys. And then once we both agree that I received the goods, then you and I can just settle the score. We don't need this third person, but only if there's a dispute between one of us. Only if I say, hey, I never got it, and you say, no, I did send it, then we sort of call in this third person, and then you will decide which one of us is right and work together with that person to sort of get the money to him, basically.
Interesting. Yeah, I think what I described was a more primitive version of that.
Yeah.
Where it's just you and me, and we're doing a deal, and we've just got a third wallet that we need both of our keys to unlock, and I can send it there, but I can't get it back, and I can't get it sent to you without essentially you fulfilling your obligation and I agreeing that you fulfilled your obligation. There was a lot of backlash to this on the forums, but it was an interesting idea. Really, the game theory was sound, but I think it was ultimately kind of dropped. But it was interesting to see the things he was thinking about. The Bitcoin code base also revealed many of the more or less arbitrary parameters that Nakamoto picked, as he'd already hinted at one of the cryptography mailing list earlier. As he'd already hinted at on the cryptography mailing list earlier, a new block should be found on average every 10 minutes. Clusters of 2016 blocks would then be used to adjust the mining difficulty. If the 2016 blocks were found in less than 2 weeks, Bitcoin's difficulty would be adjusted upwards proportionally. And if it took more than 2 weeks to find the 2016 blocks, the proof of work difficulty would adjust downwards. Why do you think he picked 2016 blocks? I have an interesting theory on this, but I want to hear yours first.
There is a sort of a technical argument to be made for it, which has to do with a type of attack where you seclude a node from the network by basically, it gets very technical here, but I'll just keep going. So you basically pick a node and then you make several connections to that node on your own. So that node has no connection with the rest of the network anymore. And then if you could adjust the difficulty faster than 2 weeks, if you could start doing that immediately, basically, then it becomes relatively easy to attack that specific node after that. Now, I don't know if that is the reason why Satoshi picked 2 weeks, but it does work out that makes it much harder to perform this type of attack. In general, I don't think Satoshi actually explained why 2 weeks. So this is sort of more a posteriori kind of reasoning why that may have been a decision. What's your theory?
My conspiracy theory is that it's the cipher or the reverse of Executive Order 6102. So if you flip those two things, it was a little Easter egg, a little nugget.
Wait, really?
Yeah. It'll blow your mind right now.
I think that's why he picked it. Yeah.
So I think
never thought about that.
So I think
it's also just 2 weeks. Yeah, it's also just if you do that times 10 minutes, you just get to 2 weeks. But I guess it's possible. Yeah.
I think he could have changed it to 9 minutes to get to 3 weeks, or he would have figured out a way to make it work. I think.
Maybe. You think it's an Easter egg?
I think it's an Easter egg.
Possible.
I found some other ones. We'll talk about it later.
All right.
But there's my little treat.
It's an interesting one.
21 million. The most interesting newly revealed property of all, however, was Bitcoin's monetary policy. Nakamoto announced in his email, total circulation will be 21 million coins. It'll be distributed to network nodes when they make blocks, with the amount cut in half every 4 years. And he goes on and discusses the halving schedule. Why do you think he picked 21 million?
Again, Satoshi did mention that it seemed like a good ballpark number. He said that at some point on Bitcoin Talk. Just not too many, not too few. But why exactly 21 million? Why not 20 million? Why not 10 million? Why not 100 million? That seems arbitrary. Do you have another conspiracy theory on this?
I don't have one just yet, but I'm definitely thinking about it.
Work on it.
I'm working on it.
Well, there is an interesting nugget here as well, which is, so do you know what percentage of the total supply was mined in the first 4 years?
50%.
Yeah. What about the next 4 years?
75%.
No. What was
25%.
Right. And after that,
12.5.
Right. So how many Bitcoins were in each block in the first 4 years?
50.
And then the next 4 years?
25.
Right. So that matches, right?
Uh-huh.
So in the first 4 years, it was 50 coins. So
I see what you're saying, yeah.
How many coins are there now in the new block? Are we down to 3
I think
coins?
we're down to 3.125 or something like that.
Right. So then you immediately know in this 4-year era, 3 point something % of new Bitcoins will come into the Like it matches up evenly. Yeah. Gotcha. That's not necessarily true for every number he could have picked, but for this number, it worked out. So I don't know, but it is a maybe a Easter egg. Maybe I
think there's an Easter egg. I might have something written in my notes somewhere. I'm gonna have to refresh my memory on it, but it is an interesting one.
Yeah, but for the most part, it seems like 21 was like an arbitrary number. There's no technical reason or no explanation from Satoshi himself why he picked 21.
When that runs out, the system can support transaction fees if needed. So we discussed that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting or the important part, of course, is not so much 21 million, but just the concept of a fixed supply.
Yeah.
Like that's what ultimately matters.
So yeah,
if it was 100 million or 10 million or even 1 million or and keep in mind, of course, Satoshi are divisible into 100 million. So there's really 21 million times 100 million, like individual units. But yeah, the important part is, of course, the fixed supply.
I think to me, that's probably the most important part. I think that's this idea of absolute scarcity, I think is something that has never really been discovered before in anything that humans have ever done. This absolutely scarce. There's only ever going to be 21 million. I think that's a powerful thing.
That's the important thing. I would say in the case of Bitcoin, that and the censorship resistant aspects, these are the two kind of core features that make the system valuable and make it work.
So how Finney talks about this, I think he kind of realized the incentive alignment here. He says, one immediate problem with any new currency is how to value it. He wrote, even ignoring the practical problem that virtually no one will accept it at first, there is still a difficulty in coming up with a reasonable argument in favor of a particular non-zero value for the coins. Then he goes on with the quote we talked about. Is it really 100 million to 1? Or 10 million? Yeah. Was it 100 million to 1? Yeah. He says. And he kind of talks about the game theory. Overcoming the classic chicken and egg problem that previous digital cash projects had suffered from, Bitcoin could in fact benefit from a positive feedback loop. In a way, Finney had flipped Ludwig von Mises' regression theorem on its head. Rather than deriving the value of a currency from its purchasing power in the past, the Cypherpunks suggested that a currency's value can initially be derived from its expected purchasing power in the future. It might make sense just to get some in case it catches on. Satoshi Nakamoto agreed. If enough people think that way, the same way, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right.
Yeah, so we discussed in an earlier episode why it makes sense from an economic perspective to have a fixed supply, like this what Hayek wrote about early in his life. But also from a very pragmatic perspective, it makes sense. It allows this sort of game theoretical self-fulfilling prophecy to potentially play out. So even if you don't care about the economic part, it's still like but you care about the digital cash part, then it still makes sense that you would include that sort of incentive model in the currency, as Helvig there adequately explained.
So back to Hayek. This was a solution to Hayek's final problem and kind of what he said. Bitcoin can help fix a lot of the problems that existed that he pointed out, right? Bitcoin is this homogeneous, borderless type of money with a fixed supply. And it goes back to what Hayek described as a neutral money, right?
Yeah, and of course it represents the separation of money and state, which Hayek later promoted.
Bitcoin could make an end to monetary nationalism. Bitcoin could put an end to currency wars. Bitcoin could also make an end to the Cantillon effect. The final point of centralization.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this.
Yeah, so the Genesis book, of course, tells the prehistory of Bitcoin. It's like the origin story of Bitcoin. But I actually decided to end it with Satoshi disappearing because I think that was his final touch. So he designed this whole system. He launched it. He ran it at first. He mined it as well, probably, or at least certainly actually he mined some coins at least. But for Bitcoin to be truly decentralized, he had to leave himself, I think. I think even if technically Bitcoin operated independently of him, I think in a very practical way, humans will just follow the leader of a project. So I think Satoshi disappearing really finalized sort of the design of Bitcoin itself. By Satoshi disappearing, Bitcoin truly became a decentralized peer-to-peer project that's developed and carried and used by its own users without anyone deciding where the project needs to go or how it needs to develop or, what needs to happen with it. No, with Satoshi disappearing, Bitcoin really becomes this bottom-up internet protocol that's steered in whatever direction its users themselves want. Now it can be improved, and it has been improved, and it can, there are developers working on it, but ultimately, it's up to, for one, the developers among themselves, they don't have an obvious leader. So whatever improvements happen to Bitcoin really requires sort of consensus within the developer community. This is something that was discussed. We discussed it in an earlier episode with the Eric S. Raymond sort of vision for the Bazaar model, right? Like developers need to be motivated to work on it, and therefore developers
They have to have buy-in.
Yeah, they need to believe in the project. It needs to stand for something that they stand for. So no one there is in charge. It's carried by developers. But even bigger than that is that the software that they develop needs to be adopted by users. And users ultimately, adopt software that they actually want to use, that offers some kind of benefit to them. So while Bitcoin is developed over the years, and it's still being developed, so far this has not led to some sort of chaos where everyone's doing their own thing, no one is in charge. No, everyone has a benefit to work on a reliable system. Everyone has a benefit to work on a system that remains as one, and therefore that the incentives really align for Bitcoin to be this sort of bottom-up, spontaneous order that continues to thrive to this day.
It's like the anarchy of the MIT lab, where it just kind of works, right?
Yeah, the incentives align for it to work, and as long as the incentives align, things tend to work out.
Satoshi mined a lot of the initial coins. At least a lot of them have been attributed to him. He's never moved any of those coins, he or she. Why do you think that is? When you think about Satoshi,
yeah, well, that is kind of disputed. I think it's likely. I will admit, I do think so. There's been this statistical analysis of the early coins mined, and there's good reason to believe that a lot of these early coins, like 1 million of them, were mined by the same entity. And then the most likely candidate for that would be Satoshi himself. So there is a good chance that Satoshi owns like 1 million coins, and most of these coins have never moved. So he would still own these 1 million coins. Now, this is speculation. So it is based on some sort of analysis of what I was just explaining. But it's not, first of all, it's not completely obvious or sure that this analysis is correct in the first place. Maybe there's another reason to think that these coins were all mined by the same entity, which was like, maybe there was some sort of quirk in early software. It's not a given that that's true. And then second, you don't know for sure if that was actually Satoshi. Maybe it was someone else mining all these coins. So are we sure that Satoshi mined 1 million coins? Or I'm saying 1 million, but it's somewhere in that area. Are we sure? No, but I do find it fairly likely. Then the follow-up question is, well, why wouldn't he sell these coins, or why wouldn't he use them? Well, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that question. What do you think?
I think that he is one of those visionary individuals that have changed the course of human history and global history. That I think he did this for something. Although it was to fix the money, it was more than just money itself, right? So I don't think he did it to enrich himself. I think it was a selfless act, the work, the hours, the code. And I think it was inspired by a lot of the things that we've talked about in your book.
Yeah, well, at the very least, we can establish that, he didn't pre-mine. It was a fair launch. So whatever benefit Satoshi got from it, anyone else could have gotten from it as well. He didn't have any privileges within the system. So even if he did mine 1 million coins, well, anyone could have done that. It's not like he was hiding the Bitcoin system. He was promoting it. He was sending it to other people. He was, posting it on a cryptography mailing list. I'm sure that if the New York Times wanted to post it on their front page, he would have been happy with that as well. But, if you had sent the white paper to the New York Times in 2008, they probably wouldn't have published it. So, he did what he could to sort of promote it. And at that point, can you blame him for using the system himself? Can you blame him for mining the coins himself?
No.
Expending his own resources to earn them like everyone else could have done.
But he didn't. He's never even moved the coins. Yeah.
He played by the rules that... but my point is, even if he does move the coins, even if it does spend the coins...
If he doesn't, it means nothing.
He has every right to do that. He mined the coins fair and square. Everyone could have done that. I would have no issue with him selling the coins or spending them. I think he earned them fair and square.
But I think it says something that he hasn't.
If they are his coins, then it says, well, what does it say for you?
For me, it proves that he did this selflessly, and he hasn't used any of them to enrich himself, with any kind of worldly gains, I would say, maybe he just has a very long time preference, right? Maybe he's still got it. Well, I think, being one of the richest wallets in the world, you could literally have anything you wanted, right? Yet he hasn't.
If he controls the coins and he didn't sell them, then he definitely has some self-discipline. We can agree on that.
That is true. In a world with top-down, centrally managed fiat currencies and all their troubles, Bitcoin represents a potent expression of spontaneous order. Aaron van Wirdum, thank you.
Thank you.